Can I be sued for... Yes, this is the United States. You can be sued for anything. Somebody once sued because Google Maps gave bad directions. I worked at McDonald's when I was a kid and somebody threatened to sue me because I wouldn't sell them a Whopper. Anybody can bring a lawsuit, even if it's a frivolous one. The question really is, how much exposure is there? So when I think about exposure, I think about a couple of things. The obvious one is monetary exposure. You're thinking about what is the potential dollar value of some claim that somebody brings. What kind of damages would there be? What's the likelihood that they would prevail on the claim? And you can sort of do some calculations related to all of this. Ways that you might mitigate the monetary exposure would be reducing the likelihood that somebody brings a claim, reducing or increasing the strength of the defense against liability for this kind of activity, reducing the dollar value of damages, perhaps having some contractual provisions that give you some limitations on liability or disclaim warranties. And you can also think about getting common types of insurance that might cover some of the monetary exposure for these things. The other type of exposure I would just call practical exposure. And in the early stages of a tech startup, I think I'd be thinking primarily about the potential influence that a claim might have during a due diligence process, either in an investment or in an acquisition. So when you get to due diligence, the investors are looking at the whole status of the company. The litigation is going to be a sort of primary category of exposure that they're looking at. Things that they'll be asking are, are there any pending lawsuits or are there any threatened claims against the company? And you're going to be required, both as a function of due diligence and then the actual transaction documents, to disclose these things to the investors. Now, anything related to intellectual property of the company is going to be a really primary concern for investors. Another category might be claims or enforcement actions by government agencies. A recent example of this might be cities shutting down scooter companies. If there's a claim against the startup that's related to the entire business model, then that could potentially be concerning to investors as well. Also things related to co-founder disputes, things with equity, prior investor rights, and some types of employment lawsuits as well would be things that could potentially be off-putting to investors. Practically speaking, there's rarely going to be a situation where a company goes into due diligence without at least something that needs some focus and attention. But certainly you're in a better position if you go into a due diligence process without some sort of claim that could shut down the deal. So like I say, most companies are going to have some sort of issue going into due diligence, and a lot of them are going to be related to claims or potential claims against the company. And a lot of times that might result from some sort of calculated thinking. With the scooter companies, for example, not all of them were going to wait for cities to come up with rules and regulations to permit scooter operations, especially when there were other heavily venture-backed companies that were competing in the space and doing exactly that. In other instances, there's really not a great cost-benefit analysis that led to some of the exposure. There was either, some actors, being a little cavalier, or possibly that there was just not knowledge that there was some exposure there. So those are the things that you definitely want to avoid. Certainly having a good lawyer would help on some fronts, and they'll be able to help out with risk mitigation strategies on particular issues and an overall strategy for the company. But they'll probably be like me and tell you, yes, you can get sued.